What really happened to the body of that crucified man when night fell over Jerusalem? That question, seemingly simple, has generated more debates, theories, and beliefs than almost any other historical event. Because what happened to that body in the hours following his death was not a simple burial. It was the beginning of something that would forever change the history of humanity. This is the story of that body, from the moment it was taken down from the cross to the mystery that still defies all explanation today. The ninth hour. It was the ninth hour, 3 in the afternoon, when Jesus expired on the cross. The sun had hidden behind a darkness that covered the whole land from noon, and now, with his last breath, the temple curtain had been torn in two from top to bottom, the earth had shaken, and the rocks had split. The centurion standing in front of the cross, a man hardened by dozens of executions, had declared with a firm voice, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." But the crowd that had come to witness the spectacle began to disperse. The chief priests and Pharisees breathed a sigh of relief. The danger had been eliminated. The soldiers prepared to follow the usual crucifixion protocol. Roman procedure was relentless and efficient. To ensure the condemned were truly dead before the Sabbath began, soldiers typically broke the legs of the crucified with a mallet, preventing them from pushing up to breathe and hastening death. It was routine work for them, something they had done hundreds of times. But when they approached Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers took his spear and thrust it into the right side of the lifeless body. From the wound flowed a stream of blood and water that modern physicians have identified as evidence of actual death, likely pericardial fluid mixed with blood, the unmistakable sign that the heart had ruptured. The Gospel of John, written by an eyewitness, emphasizes this detail because he knew it would be crucial for those who would later doubt the reality of the death. Joseph of Arimathea's request. As the soldiers completed their work, a man approached Pilate's praetorium. His name was Joseph, from Arimathea, a small town in Judea, and he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the council that had condemned Jesus. But Joseph had not consented to the decision or the actions of his colleagues. Luke describes him as a good and righteous man who was waiting for the kingdom of God. He was a disciple of Jesus, though secretly for fear of the Jews. Now, with a courage he had not shown before, he appeared before the Roman governor and requested the body of the crucified man. It was a risky act, because requesting the body of a man condemned for sedition could place him under suspicion with the Roman authorities. Pilate was surprised. It was not common for a member of the Sanhedrin to request the body of a condemned man, much less to do so with such urgency. Moreover, it struck him as strange that Jesus had already died, because crucifixions usually lasted for days, sometimes 2 or 3 days, until asphyxiation finally claimed the victim. He called the centurion who had been in charge of the execution and asked if he was really dead. The centurion confirmed the death, explaining what he had seen and how the body had been pierced with the spear. Pilate then granted the body to Joseph. The detail of the spear wound is crucial because critics of the resurrection throughout the centuries have suggested that Jesus may have survived the crucifixion, that he was taken down alive and then revived in the tomb. This theory, known as the swoon theory or the Muslim theory, has been defended by some skeptics since the 18th century, but the spear wound decisively rules out that possibility. The flow of blood and water described in the Gospels is a phenomenon that forensic physicians have carefully studied. When a body dies by asphyxiation on a cross, the pericardial fluid and blood separate and can flow when pierced. A living man, by contrast, would have bled profusely, and his side would have pulsed with each heartbeat. There was no pulse, no pulsating arterial blood, only the slow flow of a body that no longer had life. Modern physicians who have analyzed this account agree that the description is medically accurate and describes the actual death of a crucified man. The descent from the cross. With Pilate's permission in hand, Joseph went to Golgotha. The place of the skull was now almost deserted. The soldiers had withdrawn to their barracks. The curious had gone home. Only a few women remained watching from a distance, now approaching when they saw someone attending to the body. There was also Nicodemus, the Pharisee who had come to Jesus at night 3 years ago, bringing with him an immense quantity of spices. Joseph climbed up to the cross, likely helped by his servants, and began to remove the nails that fastened Jesus' hands and feet. The task was delicate and painful. The nails, made of forged iron, had passed through the bones and bent under the weight of the body. Extracting them without causing further damage to a body already broken required strength and care. When the body was free, Joseph received it in his arms. It was a body broken by the scourging, the thorns, the nails, and the hours of agony. The back was one single open wound from the Roman whips. The head still bore the marks of the crown of thorns. The hands and feet showed the holes left by the nails. But it was the body of his master, and he held it with the dignity it deserved. They carefully lowered it, laid it on a stone, and began the burial preparations.
The burial preparation. Joseph had brought a fine linen shroud, newly purchased. Nicodemus brought about 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes, an immense quantity, worth the equivalent of several months' wages for a laborer. It was an act of love and courage, because Nicodemus also risked his position in the Sanhedrin by publicly associating himself with the body of a condemned man. Together, Joseph and Nicodemus began to prepare the body for burial, according to Jewish customs. They wrapped the body in linen strips, placing the aromatic spices between the folds. The myrrh and aloes served not only a funerary purpose, but also helped contain the smell of decay and preserve the body during the days before the final burial. It was hurried work because the sun was beginning to set, and with sunset would begin the Sabbath, the day of rest when no work was permitted under the law of Moses. They did not have time to complete the embalming process, only the essentials so that the body would be decently buried before night fell over Jerusalem. The women watching from a distance took note of everything, planning to return after the Sabbath to finish the work. The new tomb. Joseph had a new tomb cut into the rock in a garden near the place of crucifixion. It was a tomb he had built for himself, where no one had yet been laid. This detail is important because it guaranteed there would be no confusion with other bodies, something that would prove crucial in the days to come. Tombs of the era consisted of a burial chamber carved into limestone, with lateral niches where bodies were placed. The entrance was low, barely 3 feet high, and was sealed by rolling a large disc-shaped stone along a groove carved into the rock. Once the stone was rolled into place, it was nearly impossible to move from the outside without help. Joseph and Nicodemus placed the body in that tomb, arranged the wrappings with the spices, and then rolled the stone to seal the entrance. Mark mentions that Joseph bought a shroud, took down the body, wrapped it in the shroud, and placed it in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Everything was done with the haste required by the urgency of the moment, but with the care that the body of the one they loved deserved. The women watching. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, the mother of Joseph, were sitting opposite the tomb. They had followed the whole process from a distance, observing where they placed the body, memorizing the exact location. Salome, the mother of James and John, was also there, along with other women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. They had not been able to participate in the preparation because there was no time, but they planned to return after the Sabbath with more spices to complete the funeral ritual. They knew where the body was. They could testify that it had been placed there. Mark notes that they saw where he was laid, a detail that would prove fundamental when the disciples needed to know which tomb to go to at dawn on the 3rd day. The Sabbath of Silence. At sunset, When the first stars appeared in the sky, the Sabbath began. The entire city entered into rest. Trumpets sounded from the temple, announcing the start of the holy day, and all activities ceased. The disciples were hiding in a house with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, fearing that the persecution that had finished their master would spread to them. The women kept silence in their homes, waiting for the day of rest to pass so they could return to the tomb. The chief priests breathed a sigh of relief, believing the danger had passed forever. They had managed to eliminate the one who threatened their power, and now peace had returned to Jerusalem. Jesus' body rested in the tomb, wrapped in linen and spices, awaiting the dawn of the third day. But the chief priests were not entirely at ease. They remembered that Jesus had said he would rise on the third day, and they went to Pilate to ask him to seal the tomb and place a guard. Pilate agreed. "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." They went, sealed the stone, and posted soldiers to guard the tomb. They wanted to ensure that no one stole the body and then claimed he had risen. Without knowing it, they were creating the conditions that would make the testimony of the empty tomb even more solid. But what would happen at daybreak would change everything they thought they knew about death and about life. The dawn of the third day. As the Sabbath night drew to a close, the women prepared to go out. They carried with them the aromatic spices they had bought to complete the embalming. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome walked toward the tomb in the twilight of dawn. The city was still asleep, but they advanced with determination, moved by love and devotion for the one who had changed their lives. As they walked through the empty streets of Jerusalem and then along the path leading to the garden outside the walls, a question accompanied them. Who will roll away the stone from the entrance for us? They knew the stone was enormous, that they could not move it by themselves. Mark describes that the stone was very large, but they kept walking, driven by something stronger than reason. But when they reached the garden, the stone was no longer in its place. It had been rolled away, and the entrance to the tomb was open. Not only that, Matthew adds a detail that none of them witnessed, but that the soldiers would later recount. There was a great earthquake that morning, and an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, rolled away the stone, and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. The guards that the chief priests had placed to guard the tomb had fallen like dead men, terrified by that heavenly apparition. The empty tomb. Mary Magdalene, seeing the stone removed, did not enter the tomb. She turned and ran to find Simon Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is how John refers to himself in his gospel. She told them, breathless, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." In her mind, the only possible explanation was that someone had stolen the body. She was not expecting a resurrection, despite Jesus having announced it. Meanwhile, the other women approached, entered the tomb, and found a young man dressed in white sitting on the right side. They were frightened, but the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." Then he gave them an instruction. "Go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee." The disciples' race. Peter and John ran toward the tomb. John, younger, arrived first, but stopped at the entrance, bending down to look inside. He saw the linen wrappings lying on the ground, but he did not go in. Peter, with his impulsive character, arrived later and went straight in without hesitating. He observed the wrappings and saw that the face cloth that had been on Jesus' head was not lying with the wrappings, but was rolled up in a place by itself. Then John went in, and when he saw this, he believed. The forensic detail of the wrappings is one of the most fascinating aspects of the account.
If the disciples had stolen the body, as the enemies of Christianity would later claim, they would have taken it with the wrappings on, or removed them hastily. They would have had neither the time nor the reason to carefully unwind the wrappings and leave the face cloth folded separately. The state of the linens suggests something very different from a theft. It suggests that the body had emerged from them like a chrysalis leaves its cocoon behind, leaving the wrappings empty but intact, in the form they had taken around the body. It was as if the body had dematerialized inside the wrappings, leaving them collapsed upon themselves, but retaining their structure. The face cloth, rolled up separately, indicated order and calm, not the haste of thieves. The initial theories. The disciples' first reaction was bewilderment. They were not expecting a resurrection. Their first interpretation was that someone had taken the body. The chief priests, upon learning what had happened, gathered with the elders and offered a considerable sum of money to the soldiers to say that the disciples had come by night and stolen the body while they were sleeping. If the soldiers were asleep, how could they know who had stolen the body? But the story served the authorities to contain the rumor that was beginning to spread. Matthew records that this story was spread among the Jews to his time, indicating that the theft explanation was the authorities' official response to the phenomenon of the empty tomb. The authorities' dilemma. The problem for the chief priests and the Romans was that the tomb was empty, and they knew it. They had posted guards precisely to prevent anyone from stealing the body, but the guards had fled after the earthquake and the appearance of the angel. If the disciples had stolen the body, why had the guards not stopped them? If the disciples had stolen it, how could they have moved the stone without waking the soldiers? And if the soldiers were asleep, how did they know it was the disciples who stole the body? The official version had too many holes, but it was the only one they could offer. Moreover, if the disciples had stolen the body, why did the chief priests not arrest them and recover the body? They knew who they were, they knew where they were hiding, but they did not do it because they could not prove the theft and because they feared the people who still remembered Jesus. The appearances began. While the authorities tried to control the narrative, something was happening that no amount of money could silence. Mary Magdalene had stayed by the tomb weeping after Peter and John left. She bent down to look inside and saw two angels dressed in white sitting where the body had been. They asked her why she was weeping. She answered, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." As she turned, she saw a man standing there who asked her the same thing. She thought he was the gardener, and said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Then the man called her by name, Mary. She recognized the voice and replied, "Rabboni," which means teacher. It was the same voice she had heard by the Sea of Galilee, the same one that had freed her from 7 demons, the same one that had taught her about the love of God. The body she sought was not in the tomb, because it no longer belonged to the tomb. He was alive, and she had seen him with her own eyes. The appearances to the disciples. That same day, 2 disciples were walking to Emmaus, a village about 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they conversed about the events of those days, a stranger joined them and asked what they were discussing. They, with sadness on their faces, told him everything that had happened to Jesus of Nazareth, how the chief priests had condemned him to death, how they had crucified him, and how that very morning the women had found the tomb empty. The stranger explained the scriptures to them, beginning with Moses and continuing through all the prophets, showing them how the Messiah had to suffer in order to enter his glory. When they reached the village, they urged him to stay with them because the day was nearly over. As they sat at the table, the stranger took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. It was Jesus. And at that same moment he vanished from their sight.
The body that passes through walls.
That same evening, the disciples were gathered in a house with the doors locked for fear of the Jews. Thomas was not with them. Suddenly, Jesus stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They, terrified, thought they were seeing a spirit. But Jesus showed them his hands and his side and said, "Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see, because a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." To prove to them that he was not a ghost, he asked for something to eat, and they gave him a piece of broiled fish, which he ate in their presence. This detail is important because in the ancient world it was believed that ghosts could not eat. Luke emphasizes that Jesus ate to show that his body was real, not a ghostly apparition. 8 days later, Thomas, who had not been present, put his finger in the wounds and believed. The Ascension. 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus gathered with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. During those days, he had appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, as Paul records in his letter to the Corinthians. He spoke to them about the kingdom of God, promised them the Holy Spirit, and as he was blessing them, he began to ascend. A cloud received him and hid him from their sight. The disciples stood looking toward heaven until 2 men dressed in white said to them, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." Later traditions. What happened to the tomb after that day? Tradition tells that the Christians of Jerusalem venerated the place for centuries. When the Emperor Hadrian rebuilt Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina in the year 135, he built a temple dedicated to Venus over the site of the tomb, perhaps to erase its memory. But what Hadrian did not know was that this very construction would preserve the exact location for future generations. 3 centuries later, when the Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, his mother, Helena, traveled to Jerusalem to seek the holy places. There, beneath the Temple of Venus, they found the empty tomb. Over it was built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which still stands in Jerusalem today as the most ancient testimony of the empty tomb. Historical evidence. Historians point to an undeniable fact. No enemy of Christianity was ever able to produce the body of Jesus. If the disciples had stolen the body, the Jewish or Roman authorities could have exhumed it to put an end to the nascent faith. If Jesus had not really died on the cross, the Romans could have paraded him alive to prove he had not risen. But they could not do it, because the body was not where they themselves had placed it. The 2nd century Christian apologist, Justin Martyr, could still challenge his Jewish opponents by saying, "You can go to Jerusalem and see that the tomb is empty." The Jews could not refute him because they knew it was true. The stolen body theories. The theft hypothesis has historical and logical weaknesses. The disciples, who were terrified and hiding after the crucifixion, hardly had had the courage to face the Roman guards to steal a body. Moreover, if they had stolen it, why would they have died preaching something they knew was false? History is full of people who die for what they believe to be true, but no one dies for what they know to be a lie. And the 11 disciples, except John, died as martyrs proclaiming that they had seen the risen Lord. Peter was crucified upside down, Andrew crucified in Patras, James beheaded, Thomas pierced with a spear in India. There is no record of any of them recanting their testimony. The mass burial theory. Some have suggested that Jesus' body was thrown into a common grave, as was typical with crucified individuals. But the account of Joseph of Arimathea is consistent and early. Mark, the oldest gospel, was written when many witnesses were still alive, probably in the 60s of the 1st century.
If Joseph had not requested the body, if Jesus had been buried in a common grave, the enemies of Christianity could easily have pointed it out. They did not do so because they knew Joseph's tomb was empty. Moreover, the fact that Joseph is mentioned as a member of the Sanhedrin and as a secret disciple is a detail the early Christians would not have invented, because early Christians typically did not highlight members of the council that had condemned Jesus unless it was a historical fact. The debate over the Jerusalem tomb. Today, two sites compete to be Jesus' tomb: the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has been venerated since the 4th century, and the Garden Tomb, discovered in the 19th century. Archaeology has confirmed that the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was indeed an abandoned quarry in Jesus' time, with tombs carved into the rock, and that it was venerated as the place of the resurrection from long before Constantine. The weight of historical and archaeological evidence supports the authenticity of the site. The Christians of Jerusalem never lost the memory of the place where their ancestors had been buried, and when Hadrian built over it, he preserved the location forever. The legacy of the absent body. The empty tomb became the most powerful symbol of the Christian faith, not because the absence of a body proves the resurrection, but because that absence, together with the appearances, transformed a group of terrified men into courageous witnesses who changed the world. The story of the early Christians is not the story of men remembering a dead teacher, but of men who were convinced that this teacher had conquered death. Their conviction was not born of naive faith, but of encounters they considered as real as the bread they ate and the wounds they touched. The final question. If Jesus' body had been found somewhere, if the Romans or the Jews had been able to produce it, the history of Christianity would have ended before it began. But they did not find it. The disciples did not search for a body because they knew it was not in the tomb. The women did not find a body because there was no longer a body to find. And that absence, that empty tomb, became the cornerstone of a faith that would traverse the centuries, bring down empires, and transform the lives of millions of people who, like those first disciples, have come to the conviction that that body was not stolen, not hidden, not moved, but rose. Because if the tomb was occupied, Christianity would not exist, and yet it does exist. And that is the question each person must answer for themselves. History cannot prove the resurrection like a scientific experiment, but it can demonstrate that the tomb was empty, that those who claimed to have seen the crucified alive died for that testimony, and that no other explanation has been able to satisfactorily account for all the facts, and that, at least, deserves an answer.